History doesn't bury its darkest stories. It just stops talking about them. This is the medical grimoire, where medicine, history, and darkness meet. I'm your narrator, and tonight, we go back. Tonight, we enter the Renaissance, an age of rebirth, of art, of discovery, and of men who built the foundations of modern medicine by stealing bodies in the middle of the night. It is past midnight. The city of Leuven is silent. A young man, and not yet 20 years old, climbs the wooden post of a public gallows on the outskirts of town. The body hanging there has been dead for days. The flesh has begun to decay. The smell is extraordinary. He doesn't stop. He works quickly, carefully, in the dark, cutting the rope, lowering the body, carrying it back through the empty streets to his rooms at the university. He has done this before. He will do it again. His name is Andreas Vesalius. He is a medical student, and what he is about to do with that stolen body will change the course of human medicine forever. Welcome to the medical grimoire. Tonight we go back to the 16th century, to the dissection tables of Renaissance Europe, to the forbidden knowledge locked inside the human body, and to the man who risked everything to unlock it. Andreas Vesalius was born in Brussels in 1514 into a family with deep roots in medicine and pharmacy. His father was apothecary to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. His great-grandfather had written a commentary on the works of the ancient physician Avicenna. Medicine was the family business, and Vesalius entered it young, driven, and with an appetite for knowledge that would quickly outrun the limits of what his teachers were prepared to offer. To understand what Vesalius was up against, you need to understand the state of anatomy in early 16th century Europe. For over 1,000 years, the definitive authority on the structure of the human body had been Galen of Pergamon, the same Galen whose humoral theory had failed so catastrophically in the face of the Black Death 2 centuries earlier. Galen had written extensively on anatomy, producing detailed descriptions of the body's organs, bones, muscles, and vessels that were accepted as essentially complete and essentially correct. There was one significant problem. Galen had performed almost no dissections on human bodies. The Roman Empire's prohibitions against disturbing the dead had pushed him toward animal subjects, primarily Barbary macaques, pigs, and dogs. His anatomical writings were therefore a description of animal anatomy, extrapolated with considerable confidence and considerable error onto the human form. For 12 centuries, the physicians and surgeons of Europe had been learning human anatomy from a text based primarily on monkeys. And the remarkable thing, the genuinely astonishing thing, is that nobody had seriously checked. Not because the bodies weren't available, not because dissection was universally forbidden, but because the authority of Galen was considered so absolute that contradicting him was not merely incorrect. It was, in a very real sense, unthinkable. When human dissections were performed at medieval and Renaissance universities, which did happen in a limited and highly formalized way, they were theatrical events. A professor sat at a high lectern, reading aloud from Galen. A barber surgeon performed the actual cutting below, exposing the organs. A demonstrator pointed at the relevant structures. If what the surgeon exposed did not match what Galen had described, the assumption was that the body was abnormal or that the surgeon had cut incorrectly. The text was the truth. The body was supposed to confirm it. This was the world Vesalius entered as a student, and first at the University of Leuven, then in Paris under the great Galenic anatomist Jacobus Silvius. He was brilliant, ambitious, and increasingly frustrated. He wanted to cut. He wanted to look. And what he was seeing in the bodies he managed to get his hands on was not matching what he was reading in Galen. Human dissection in the 16th century occupied a strange and uncomfortable legal and religious space. It was not universally forbidden. The Catholic Church's actual position on dissection was more permissive than popular history often suggests, and by the early 1500s, several Italian universities had formal anatomical theaters where public dissections were performed. But access to bodies was tightly controlled, irregular, and deeply insufficient for anyone who wanted to do serious anatomical work. The bodies available for dissection were almost exclusively those of executed criminals, condemned to a second degradation after death as a further punishment, a deterrent to crime, a statement by the state that even the corpse of a criminal belonged to the authority that had ended their life. Supply depended on the rate of executions, the season, and the goodwill of local authorities. In cold weather, bodies preserved longer. In summer, they decayed within days. There were never enough. For a student like Vesalius, with an insatiable need to understand the body from the inside, this scarcity was intolerable. So he went out and took what he needed. The accounts of Vesalius's body-snatching activities come partly from his own later writings, in which he describes his early anatomical education with a candor that is startling given the legal and social risks involved. He describes climbing gallows. He describes collecting bones from the Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris, where the bodies of the poor were deposited in mass graves and left to the elements. He describes assembling complete skeletons from fragments gathered over multiple nocturnal expeditions, piece by piece, hiding the bones in his clothing and carrying them back through city streets. In Leuven, the defining episode of his early career took place outside the city walls at the site of a public execution. The body of a convicted criminal had been chained to a post and left to decompose as a public warning, a common practice. Vesalius, recognizing the opportunity, returned to the site repeatedly over several nights, removing pieces of the body until he had enough to reconstruct an almost complete skeleton. He then reassembled it, boiled the remaining flesh from the bones, and produced his first complete skeletal preparation. He was 20 years old. The body he had stolen and disassembled in the night would become one of the first specimens in what would eventually become the most important anatomical collection in Europe. This was not unique behavior for a serious student of anatomy in the 16th century. Body snatching, grave robbing, and the clandestine acquisition of executed criminals were widespread practices among ambitious medical students and physicians across Europe. What made Vesalius different was not the theft. It was what he did with what he found. By 1537, Vesalius had completed his medical degree at the University of Padua, one of the most intellectually progressive institutions in Europe, and had been appointed at the age of 23 as professor of surgery and anatomy. It was an extraordinary appointment for such a young man, and Vesalius immediately transformed the way anatomy was taught. He abolished the theatrical separation between the professor and the body. He came down from the lectern. He picked up the blade himself. He cut and he looked, and he explained what he was seeing in real time to students gathered around the table. This was not how anatomy was taught. This was not how it had been taught for centuries. And what Vesalius was seeing when he cut with his own hands, rather than watching a barber surgeon cut, was revealing something that could no longer be explained away. Galen was wrong. Not occasionally, not in minor details, but systematically and significantly wrong about the structure of the human body, wrong about the jaw, which Galen had described as composed of two bones joined at the front, as in dogs, rather than the single bone of the human mandible. Wrong about the sternum, which Galen had described as having 7 segments, as in monkeys, rather than the 3 of the human adult. Wrong about the liver, the uterus, the network of blood vessels at the base of the brain. Wrong in many cases because he had been looking at the wrong animal. For a physician trained in the absolute authority of Galen, these discoveries were not merely intellectually challenging. They were destabilizing at a fundamental level, like discovering that the foundation of the building you live in is made of the wrong material. If Galen was wrong about the mandible, what else was he wrong about? If 12 centuries of medical education had been teaching students the anatomy of a macaque rather than a human being, what did that mean for everything built on that foundation? Vesalius's answer was to start over, to go back to the body itself, the human body cut with human hands, observed with human eyes, and describe what was actually there. To produce an anatomical atlas based entirely on direct observation, illustrated with sufficient precision and artistry that it could replace Galen not just as a text, but as a visual reference. To make the human body, for the first time in history, truly visible. He spent the next several years doing exactly that, dissecting, drawing, correcting, revising, acquiring bodies by whatever means were available, executed criminals, bodies purchased from hospital authorities, specimens provided by sympathetic judges, working through the summer when decomposition was rapid, completing dissections in days, working through the winter when the cold preserved the body longer, allowing more careful study. In 1543, Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. He was 28 years old. It is difficult to overstate what the Fabrica represented. 7 volumes, over 700 pages, more than 250 full-page woodcut illustrations of the human body, the bones, the muscles, the nervous system, the circulatory system, the organs, rendered with a precision, clarity, and artistry that had never been achieved before. The illustrations were produced in collaboration with artists from the workshop of the Venetian painter Titian, almost certainly including Jan van Calcar, who had trained under the master himself. The figures in the Fabrica stand in landscapes. They pose. A skeleton leans on a shovel in a pastoral scene. Dissected muscle men gesture dramatically against Renaissance architectural backgrounds. The bodies are not specimens laid flat on a table. They are figures, people, caught in a moment of extraordinary exposure. It is one of the strangest and most powerful decisions in the history of scientific illustration, and it was entirely deliberate. Vesalius wanted these bodies to be seen. He wanted them to be impossible to look away from. But the visual power of the Fabrica, as extraordinary as it was secondary to its intellectual content. Because embedded in the text, in the careful, methodical descriptions of what Vesalius had found in human bodies, was a systematic demolition of Galenic anatomy, error after error, corrected. Structure after structure, described accurately for the first time, and explicitly directly in his own voice, Vesalius argued that Galen had been wrong and because Galen had not studied the human body. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. Jacobus Silvius, Vesalius's own former teacher in Paris, one of the most respected Galenists in Europe, responded to the Fabrica with a pamphlet in which he called his former student a madman and a liar, and argued that the human body had changed since Galen's time, which was why Galen's descriptions no longer matched what dissectors found. This argument that the human body itself had degenerated, had become less correct over the centuries, is so spectacular in its intellectual desperation that it has become a standard example of motivated reasoning in the history of science. Other critics were less colorful but no less hostile. Vesalius had attacked not just an anatomical text, but a way of doing medicine, a way of knowing that had been in place for over a millennium. The idea that a young man with a knife could overturn what Galen had established through reason and authority was, to many of his contemporaries, not just wrong, but offensive. Vesalius, exhausted by the controversy, and perhaps genuinely shaken by the ferocity of the response, burned many of his working notes and manuscripts shortly after publication. He left academic medicine and became court physician to Emperor Charles V. He would never return to the systematic anatomical research that had produced the Fabrica. Let us be specific about what the production of the Fabrica actually required. Between his appointment in Padua in 1537 and the publication of the book in 1543, Vesalius dissected somewhere between 50 and 100 human bodies, an extraordinary number for the era, made possible only through a combination of official access, unofficial acquisition, and what we would today describe without hesitation as body snatching. The most famous single case associated with the production of the Fabrica involves a man known to history only as Jakob Carrer von Gebweiler, a notorious criminal executed in Basel in 1543, the same year the Fabrica was published. Vesalius was in Basel overseeing the printing of the book when Carrer was executed. He arranged through the local authorities to receive the body immediately after execution, before it could begin to decay. He dissected it publicly over several days, and the skeleton he prepared from it survived. It is still in existence. It sits today in the Anatomical Museum of the University of Basel, the oldest surviving anatomical preparation in the world. But not all the bodies Vesalius worked with came through official channels. Contemporary accounts and his own oblique references in the Fabrica suggest that his network of body acquisition extended to hospital workers who could provide recently deceased patients, to gravediggers who could be paid for access to fresh burials, and to his own students, whom he sent out on nocturnal expeditions to acquire material he needed. There is also the case, described with careful vagueness by Vesalius himself, of a young woman whose body he acquired for dissection, a woman who had been buried but whose death he had apparently been present for, under circumstances he does not fully explain. The body was fresh enough for detailed soft tissue dissection. How it came to be on his table, he does not say. This is the reality behind the Fabrica. The beautiful illustrations, the careful descriptions, the revolutionary science, all of it was built on bodies that were stolen, purchased, extracted from graves, and cut apart in rooms that smelled of decomposition and preserving compounds by a man who had been doing this since he was a teenager. The history of anatomy is inseparable from this history. The knowledge we have about the human body was purchased, in the most literal sense, from the dead. Vesalius was not alone in this world. The 16th century saw an explosion of anatomical activity across Europe, driven by the same appetite for direct observation that had driven Vesalius, and constrained by the same shortage of legally available bodies. The story of how anatomy acquired its raw material during this period is one of the darkest recurring chapters in medical history. The formal arrangement between anatomy and the criminal justice system, in which the bodies of executed criminals were assigned to medical schools as part of their sentence, was codified in England by the Murder Act of 1752, but its roots went back much further. In Italy, papal edicts had permitted the dissection of executed criminals at Bologna and other universities as early as the 14th century. In the German states, similar arrangements existed by the 16th century. The condemned body was a medical resource, and the state dispensed it accordingly. What this meant in practice was that anatomy became associated in the public mind with punishment, degradation, and the erasure of personhood that extended beyond death. To be dissected was to be denied burial. To be denied burial was, in the theological understanding of the era, to be denied resurrection. The anatomist's knife was not just a scientific instrument, it was, from the perspective of those whose bodies ended up on the table, a continuation of the sentence that had already taken their life. This association shaped who was dissected throughout the history of anatomy, in ways that extended far beyond the 16th century. The poor, the criminal, the socially marginal, these were the bodies that filled the anatomical theaters of Europe and later of America. Enslaved people in the American South were dissected in medical schools and used as teaching material in proportions vastly exceeding their share of the population. In the 19th century, the systematic grave robbing of black cemeteries supplied Southern medical schools with a significant portion of their anatomical material. The knowledge that modern medicine has about the human body is accurate. It is also built in part on a foundation of exploitation that we are still coming to terms with. The bodies in the anatomical atlases, in the Fabrica, in the texts that followed it, were not volunteers. They were people who had no say in what happened to them after death. Some of them had no say in what happened to them before death either. The last years of Andreas Vesalius's life are shadowed by a story that may be legend, may be distortion, and may be essentially true. It is impossible, at this distance, to fully separate the facts from the mythology that accumulated around one of medicine's most controversial figures. According to the most widely circulated account, Vesalius, by then court physician to King Philip II of Spain, living in Madrid, far from the dissection tables of Padua, performed an autopsy on a Spanish nobleman who had died under his care. When the chest was opened, witnesses claimed the heart was still beating. The man had been buried alive, or rather, had been dissected alive. The scandal was immediate and severe. Vesalius was accused before the Spanish Inquisition, faced with a charge that could have carried the death penalty. The account is almost certainly exaggerated and possibly entirely fabricated. The Spanish Inquisition has no formal record of proceedings against Vesalius. The heart of a recently dead person can continue to show muscular contractions for a short period after cardiac death. What witnesses may have seen was a physiological artifact, rather than evidence of premature autopsy. But the story spread and was believed because it fit the image of Vesalius that his enemies had constructed. A man so consumed by the desire to cut that he had finally cut too far. Whether the Inquisition story is true or not, Vesalius did leave Spain in 1564, undertaking a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, possibly as a penance imposed by church authorities, possibly as a voluntary act of piety, possibly simply as a way of escaping a court he had grown to dislike. He died on the return journey, shipwrecked on the Greek island of Zakynthos in October 1564. He was 49 years old. He had published the Fabrica 21 years earlier at 28. The remaining 2 decades of his life, spent at court, away from the work that had defined him, are often described by historians as a kind of extended exile from himself. The man who had climbed gallows at midnight to steal bodies for science spent his last years as a royal physician, attending to the ailments of kings, far from the cold rooms and the sharp blades and the extraordinary, terrifying interiors of the human dead. The Fabrica did not immediately transform European medicine. Galenic theory persisted in universities for another century and more after Vesalius's death. The physicians who had trained their entire careers in Galen did not simply discard what they knew because a 28-year-old had published a book. Change, again, was slow. But the Fabrica established something that couldn't be undone. It established that the human body itself was the primary text of medicine. Not Galen, not Avicenna, not any authority, however ancient and however respected. The body on the table, opened and examined with trained eyes and steady hands, that was where medical knowledge had to begin. Everything else was commentary. This was not just a methodological shift. It was a philosophical one. It said that the truth about nature was available to anyone willing to look carefully enough, that authority and tradition were not sufficient substitutes for observation, that the world, including the interior of the human body, could be known directly by human senses and human reason, without the mediation of ancient texts or divine revelation. This is one of the intellectual foundations of the scientific revolution, and Vesalius helped lay it in rooms that smelled of death, with stolen bodies on his table. The skeleton of Jakob Karrer von Gebweiler is still in Basel. It has been there for nearly 5 centuries. The man it belonged to was a criminal executed publicly, his body handed over to the physician who happened to be in town overseeing the printing of his book. He did not choose to contribute to the history of science. He did not choose anything at the end. But his bones are in the oldest anatomical collection in the world. And the book that Vesalius finished in Basel that year, the book that the dissection of Karrer's body, helped complete, is still in libraries around the world, still reproduced, still cited, still recognized as one of the most important scientific works ever published. The knowledge was real. The cost was real. And the distance between those two things is where the history of medicine lives, in the cold space between what we needed to know and what it took to find out. That's the story of Andreas Vesalius, the man who stole bodies from gallows and cemeteries, who cut open the human dead with his own hands, and who used what he found to overturn 12 centuries of medical authority in a single book. He was 28 years old when he published it. He died at 49, far from the work that had made him. And the skeleton he prepared in Basel in 1543 is still sitting in a museum, waiting for anyone curious enough to look. Next time on the Medical Grimoire, we move deeper into the early modern era, to the first blood transfusions, the patients who survived them, and the one death that shut the whole experiment down for 2 centuries. If this story reached you, share it, subscribe, and give your like to help. If you want to keep going deeper into the archive, I'll see you in the next episodes.